and I cannot imagine how that could be productive for the court. My esteemed colleagues will show that Azerbaijan's request presents problems for prima facie jurisdiction and advances claims that have no plausible link to rights arising under the cert. Moreover, there is no urgency or irreparable harm to any rights under the cert. Azerbaijan's request as to landmines compels the court to imagine discrimination where it does not and cannot actually exist. The purported evidence in Azerbaijan's case file contains absolutely no evidence as to who planted mines, where they were planted, when and why those mines were planted. It is worth underscoring that hundreds of thousands of landmines were planted by Azerbaijan itself in the beginning of the 90s. The presence of mines in the conflict region has affected everybody. Sadly, we have all suffered because of mines. And my country regrets the tragic loss of every single life, regardless of ethnic origin. For decades, we strive to complete a comprehensive demining process. However, Azerbaijan persistently blocked all such humanitarian efforts because persons of Armenian origin would be the primary beneficiaries. Only now, when such persons have been forced to flee, does Azerbaijan suddenly discover the value of demining. That said, the Prime Minister of Armenia has repeatedly stated that Armenia is prepared to meet with President of Azerbaijan, including to discuss the issues relating to landmines. Armenia has already provided minefield maps to Azerbaijan on 2 separate occasions. In the context of resolving all outstanding humanitarian issues, we stand ready to provide any more maps in our possession regarding minefields located behind the lines currently held by Azerbaijani armed forces, which now present solely humanitarian concern. And Armenia has made this offer despite the fact that it is under no legal obligation to provide such maps. Yet, Azerbaijan baselessly accuses Armenia of engaging in ongoing operations to salt Azerbaijan's territory with more landmines and requests that court order Armenia to stop. Madam President, while such request is blatantly outside the scope of the cert, I wish to make clear Armenia is not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan or the Republic of Artsakh. Armenia respects and abides by its obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, unlike the Republic of Azerbaijan. Even as we appear before the court today, Azerbaijan violates the ceasefire regime and has troops illegally located deep within undisputed Armenian sovereign territory. In fact, during these very proceedings, Azerbaijani forces continue to shell villages and target civilians in Armenia and Artsakh. Azerbaijan further accuses Armenia of facilitating and tolerating purported anti-Armenian hate groups and sponsoring online campaigns to disseminate hate. These accusations are factually bankrupt. Quite the contrary. The Armenian government, including Prime Minister Pashinyan, actively pursues an agenda of peace and security and reconciliation in the greater region. Indeed, The recently adopted action plan of the government explicitly defines a goal to open a new era of peaceful development for our country and region. Last week, you heard our councils displaying verbatim the hateful rhetoric President Aliyev uses to describe my people. I will not repeat these appalling insults here again. Azerbaijan's case file, of course, is completely devoid of any such language, even remotely close to such hate speech that is attributable to my government. Instead, Azerbaijan brings to the attention of the court statements of few individuals and non-governmental organizations engaged in emergency and self-defense trainings. Let me be clear. Armenia does not endorse or condone racially derogatory statements and takes all of its obligations and responsibilities under CERT very seriously. But the fact that Azerbaijan has opted to bring such allegations to the attention of the court while actually defending the horrendous statements of its own president and state officials demonstrates only one thing: its desperation to mirror Armenia's case, no matter how vacuous its own claims are. Azerbaijan's requested measure regarding the preservation of evidence is no better. It simply misses the mark. The request relates to purported right that is not in any sense plausible right under the CERT. Armenia is currently investigating crimes allegedly committed by Armenian servicemen against Azerbaijanis. However, Azerbaijan cannot transform CERT into a mutual legal assistance treaty. Moreover, to the extent that the request concerns evidence located in the territories now it controlled by Azerbaijan, such evidence would not be in Armenia's control. Our councils will elaborate on these fundamental deficiencies and still others as to this unwarranted request by Azerbaijan. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, Armenia's learned councils will now thoroughly demonstrate to you that Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures must be rejected in full. First, Professor Kolb will address the prima facie jurisdiction of the court. Second, Professor Murphy will demonstrate why Azerbaijan's requests relating to landmines and alleged cross-border actions do not satisfy the court's requirements for provisional measures. Azerbaijan's requests fail as a matter of prima facie jurisdiction, advance no plausible CERT rights, and suffer from still other fatal deficiencies. Third, Dr. Salonidis will address why Azerbaijan's request relating to the alleged incitement of racial hatred targeted at Azerbaijanis also does not comply with the requirements for provisional measures or state a plausible CERT violation. Azerbaijan's evidence neither establishes the espousal or incitement of racial hatred or violence, or any state conduct warranting the invocation of the CERT. Professor Daljan will conclude Armenia's presentation by explaining why Azerbaijan's request for the collection and preservation of evidence is inappropriate and, in any case, does not meet the requirements for provisional measures. Azerbaijan's request in this respect is outside the scope of the CERT and the court's jurisprudence. I thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the court, for your kind attention. I now kindly ask that you invite Professor Kolb to address the court.
I thank the agent of Armenia for his statement, and I now invite Professor Robert Kolb to take the floor.
Madam President, distinguished members of the court, I shall be responding this afternoon to the observations made by Professor Lowe regarding negotiation conditions. Azerbaijan would wish that you assess differently the two cases in hand, but on the contrary, Armenia is of the opinion that no distinction in this regard can be made between the two cases. In particular, Armenia recognizes that the condition of the failure of negotiations is met in the instant case. Let me remind you that Azerbaijan firmly rejected that in the related case which we dealt with last week. I'm sure the court will appreciate the difference. This notwithstanding, Armenia remains persuaded that certain provisional requests stray from the substantive scope of the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. Just to give you an example of this, what kind of link can you establish between the Convention and landmines? My colleagues will go into these aspects in greater detail, so I'll leave it to them. But I cannot prevent myself from pointing out that if we apply the strict criteria, namely link, necessity and urgency, as well as the concrete nature of the measures required, as set out last week by the other side, then the measures requested by Azerbaijan leak like a sieve. Let's apply their criteria to their claims. You will find it edifying. It is indispensable to understand the nature of negotiations in the hellish crucible of these intersecting cases. This is a peremptory reason to deal with it. I should wish to start with to look at four aspects. First of all, the unique character of the negotiations, the dilatory tactics of the other side, the exacerbation of the dispute by that self-same party, and Armenia's alleged fault in the breakdown of negotiations. So negotiation in these two cases, which you've had before you recently, has never been completely separate, the one from the other. Azerbaijan insisted on the joint nature of negotiations. They only wanted to deal with disagreements jointly. The documents in your possession demonstrate this. Now you want proof. Well, first of all, Azerbaijan notified its claims in the same letter of 8 December 2020, in which it accepted the invitation of Armenia to negotiate on Armenia's claims. But at the same time, Azerbaijan rejected them out of hand. Then, in its letter of 11 June 2021, Azerbaijan particularly insisted on addressing en bloc each party's subject for negotiation. Now, indeed, the two series of negotiations related fundamentally to the same subject matter, to wit, the 1965 Convention. Then, in its counter-proposals, Azerbaijan threw into the one pot the issue of the Military Trophies Museum and the VOMA organization. I draw the consequence that the court will not be able to disconnect the two cases when looking at prima facie jurisdiction, because that will be doing violence to this single crucible of negotiations. And after all, the distinction is an artificial one. If you look at the facts, it's only based on tactical considerations and seeks to create an imbalance between the two cases on this point. Disharmony rarely leads to justice. This morning, the other side noted that substantive negotiations did not start immediately after the first exchanges between the two parties' foreign ministers. Why? Well, it was because dilatory tactics were constantly deployed by Azerbaijan to gain the putative advantage of procrastination. You doubt this? Well, your case file in the instant case gives a scathing example. So, it took almost a year, dozens exchanges of notes, and multiple meetings to finally look at the substance of the dispute. The other side slammed on the brakes, obstructed, and dithered constantly. The modalities of negotiation needed to be clarified. Well, let's wait a bit. The continents to be discussed needed to be better defined. Well, okay, let's postpone. Negotiators had to be of the same grade. Patience, everybody. Well, I will not waste your time revisiting all this in detail, but let's compare it to the attitude of Armenia. Armenia attempted, as of the get-go, to deal with the substance of the dispute without circumvolution, without meanders, without leading up garden paths. In all of this, I see someone who is going straight towards a settlement, and I see someone who is trying to evade it. I also see someone setting traps to avoid that Article 22 of the Convention have any useful effect. On top of this, Azerbaijan did not wish that its attitude seeking delay and postponement saw the light of day. They insisted countless times on the confidentiality of the documents used in negotiations, and these questions relative to confidentiality also contributed to the eating up of time. Throughout the negotiations, Azerbaijan continued to aggravate the dispute by acts which were sometimes untimely, often questionable, and always varied. Let me give you 3 examples. First of all, the inauguration of the military trophies park. Recently, Azerbaijan removed some mannequins which were causing a scandal. Nothing could be clearer to bear witness that their presence inflamed and worsened the dispute. Is this how to create an atmosphere favourable to seeking agreement between two parties? I ask you. Then, the destruction of Armenian cemeteries and other cultural assets. A specific reference should be made to the decapitation of Shushi's cathedral and of the genocide memorial. And finally, the ill treatment meted out to prisoners and detainees. One would have you believe that the fault for the failure of negotiations falls on Armenia. This is a pretty sorry argument. Why in negotiations would it be simply the other's fault? Let me recall, moreover, that it was Armenia who initiated these negotiations. This suggests palpably who was interested in making progress. Why didn't Armenia make any proposals after the counter-proposals from Azerbaijan? Well, there is no obligations to make counter-proposals to counter-proposals after almost an entire year of negotiation. even less so when you know what Azerbaijan was doing with the one hand whilst pretending to negotiate with the other. Armenia realized that Azerbaijan did not want to negotiate on its claims. The counter-proposals of the other side sought precisely to move the negotiators further away from that perimeter. Look closely at the counter-proposals. They wandered way beyond the markers of the 1965 convention. Nothing on humane treatment or the repatriation of prisoners of war. Nothing on stopping the destruction of cultural property. Nothing on stopping their president's hate speeches. Thus, Armenia had good reason to think that no use would be served by continuing sterile negotiations. Firstly, on account of the undermining fieldwork of the sappers, then procrastination and the red herrings, and finally by the deflection of the subject of negotiations. And this all the more so given the urgency of the situation, those threats weighing on the rights in play. In these conditions, I have trouble seeing how one can successfully argue the maxim of one's own wrongdoing against Armenia. But fair enough. If Azerbaijan thinks they can argue it, I think Armenia can rely on this maxim even more so. My earlier arguments prove it. In sum, the requirements for negotiations were met in the reasonably transparent context of Mavromatis or Qatar versus UAE. Why wouldn't it be the case here? Even more so. So these reflections bring to an end my oral presentation. I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I would request, Madam President, could you call to the podium Professor Sean Murphy?
I thank Professor Kolb. I shall now give the floor to Professor Sean Murphy. You have the floor, Professor.
Thank you, Madam President. It's an honor to appear before the court and to do so on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. I will be addressing why Azerbaijan's requests with respect to landmines do not satisfy the court's requirements for interim measures of protection. As a reminder, Azerbaijan's requests are essentially twofold: that Armenia be ordered to take all necessary steps to enable Azerbaijan to remove landmines laid in Azerbaijan's territory, and that Armenia be ordered to stop planting landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. I will begin with 6 points that serve as relevant factual background to Azerbaijan's 2 requests. First, landmines are defensive weapons that have been used in armed conflict for almost 2 centuries. As explained by the Encyclopedia Britannica, landmines are typically used to disrupt or prevent the massed attack of tanks and/or infantry. Tribunals such as the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission have noted that the defensive use of landmines, that landmines are used defensively, and their legality as a matter of customary international law. In other words, typically landmines are not laid for offensive purposes, and certainly not for the purpose of racial discrimination. Second, landmines were used by all the relevant parties, including Azerbaijan, during the first Nagorno-Karabakh War, principally in the period of 1991 to 1994. Thus, the problem of landmines in this geographic area is long-standing and has led to casualties from the 1990s onward. Moreover, the problem is not just landmines, but also explosive remnants of war, to include unexploded cluster munitions, of which Azerbaijan made extensive use in its aerial and artillery attacks during the first Nagorno-Karabakh War. Persons have been killed by these mines and ordnance from the 1990s right up to the outbreak of the conflict in September 2020, as was noted by opposing counsel this morning. And that fact must be kept in mind when considering similar civilian deaths occurring thereafter. In other words, it remains the case today that a civilian death that occurs in the region may well be the consequence of mines or ordnance from the first Nagorno-Karabakh War. Third, for years, Armenia has supported the idea of regulating and even banning the use of landmines, but only if its neighbors, including Azerbaijan, agree to the same. For that reason, after the adoption in 1997 of the Ottawa Treaty on Landmines, Armenia voted in favor of the 1998 UN General Assembly resolution calling upon all states to adhere to the Ottawa Treaty. By contrast, Azerbaijan did not vote in favor of that resolution. Indeed, Armenia said at the 2017 meeting of the states parties to the Ottawa Treaty that Armenia's full participation in the treaty is contingent upon a similar level of political commitment by other parties in the region. Alas, a similar commitment has not been forthcoming from Azerbaijan, such that today neither state is a party to the Ottawa Treaty nor to Protocol 2 of the Convention on Conventional Weapons. Fourth, in the aftermath of the Nagorno-Karabakh War, Armenia strongly supported international efforts to remove landmines in Nagorno-Karabakh. Of particular note, Armenia supported the demining program funded by the US government and carried out by the UK-based non-profit organization called Halo Trust. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Halo Trust cleared thousands of landmines and more than twice that of explosive ordnance from the areas where civilians were living. Yet it is important to note that Halo Trust only cleared mines that no longer play a political or military role, and therefore it did not work along the line of contact between the military forces. In other words, it was understood that certain mines had been laid for defensive purposes along the line of contact in the eastern and northern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, which were to be left in place given the military purpose that they served. I note that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe monitored this line of contact throughout this time period, visiting the military forces arrayed on all sides, as is clear from Azerbaijan's own evidence. Further, Armenia worked closely with the OSCE on demining in Nagorno-Karabakh, but those efforts were effectively brought to an end by Azerbaijan in 2016. Fifth, this historic problem of landmines and explosive remnants of war was, of course, aggravated during the conflict that erupted in September 2020. What landmines, if any, were laid at that time is unclear. Yet the 2020 conflict certainly spawned a fresh set of explosive remnants of war, for which Azerbaijan, as the aggressor, is to blame. Indeed, a Human Rights Watch investigation in the densely populated areas of Nagorno-Karabakh uncovered, and I quote, numerous incidents in which Azerbaijan's forces used inherently indiscriminate cluster munitions and artillery rockets and other weapons that did not distinguish between military targets and civilian objects. Similarly, Amnesty International reported on Azerbaijan's use of such cluster munitions, finding that they pose a, and I quote, threat to civilians similar to anti-personal landmines and inflict suffering for civilian populations years after their use. Sixth, and finally, on the factual background, since the time of the trilateral statement of November 2020, there unfortunately has continued to be a very difficult military situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, with repeated violations of the ceasefire, notwithstanding the presence of the Russian peacekeeping forces. Military forces remain arrayed against each other in and around various parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, and minefields still exist that are important for military purposes. The border between Armenia and Azerbaijan is also a location of great concern, given statements by senior Azerbaijani officials, such as Azerbaijan's President Aliyev, about returning to places in Armenia, and given regular firing of weapons by Azerbaijan's armed forces across the border in incidents that have killed Armenian soldiers and civilians in Armenia. Of particular concern is the movement of Azerbaijan's troops into Armenia's sovereign territory since 12 May of this year, which has prompted calls such as from the French government, the Greek government, and the US government for Azerbaijan to pull back all forces immediately and cease further provocation. I mention this final factual point to highlight the situation today in Nagorno-Karabakh and along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. It remains quite fraught. There are military forces deployed throughout the area, as well as peacekeeping forces, and military and security concerns remain paramount. As such, any order by the court that were to require Armenia to divulge information that would compromise the security of military forces in this area would be deeply problematic. Madam President, members of the court, I turn now to Armenia's legal arguments with respect to Azerbaijan's two requests, starting with the request for an order that Armenia help Azerbaijan to undertake demining in Azerbaijan's territory. Armenia is well aware of the dangers to civilians of landmines and unexploded ordnance. For that reason, when the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly on 27 September of this year adopted a resolution calling for Armenia to release all mine maps in its possession, Armenian deputies, without hesitation, voted in favor of the resolution. By contrast, as Professor Darjan recalled last week, all Azerbaijan deputies voted against the resolution, perhaps because it expressed deep concern about Armenian POWs and civilians detained by Azerbaijan. Perhaps because the resolution criticized the unacceptable racially intolerant overtones exacerbated by Azerbaijan's military trophies park, and perhaps because the resolution expressed deep concern about Armenian cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. But in any event, Armenia approaches the issue of landmines in good faith and is fully willing to cooperate with UN and regional systems, with non-governmental organizations, to promote the safety and well-being of the people in the region. Armenia has already provided maps to Azerbaijan. Moreover, Armenia's Prime Minister has publicly announced his willingness to bring to a meeting with Azerbaijan's president maps of minefields that do not separate the militaries of Armenia and Azerbaijan from one another, meaning maps that have a humanitarian significance rather than a military or civilian significance. And our agent today, before this court, confirmed that willingness when he said, "We stand ready to provide any more maps in our possession regarding minefields located behind the lines currently held by Azerbaijani armed forces, which now present solely humanitarian concerns." But that goodwill of Armenia is very different from saying that Armenia has a legal obligation to enable Azerbaijan to undertake mining activities, let alone an obligation arising under the CERD. Indeed, the extraordinary breadth of a purported obligation to enable another country to do something alone casts great doubt on the obligation's existence. Allow me to begin the legal analysis by indicating two problems in finding prima facie jurisdiction over this request. One problem concerns jurisdiction ratione materiae. The court found in the Qatar v. UAE case that such jurisdiction does not exist when the measure complained of by a party is based on adverse effects caused to nationals of a party, since discrimination under the CERD does not include discrimination based on nationality. Yet this request concerning demining is clearly based on alleged harmful effects to Azerbaijan nationals as a whole, not to persons of any particular ethnic origin. Professor Lowe this morning himself referred to the harm from landmines to, and he said, people of Azerbaijan. He didn't say harm to persons of Azerbaijani ethnicity. Indeed, if, as claimed in Azerbaijan's application, Azerbaijan is a multi-ethnic country, one that includes substantial numbers of Armenians, indeed a country comprised of over 50 ethnic groups, then a concern with demining in Azerbaijan necessarily is a concern for Azerbaijan nationals generally and not to any particular ethnic group. Indeed, virtually every landmine victim listed in Azerbaijan's Annex 37 is listed as a citizen of the Republic of Azerbaijan, and none are listed as a member of an ethnic group. Another problem concerns jurisdiction ratione temporis. The CERD entered into force between the two parties in 1996. Yet, as I will soon explain, the only confirmed mine areas, according to Azerbaijan's application in this case, are along the line of contact between military forces that arose at the end of the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. If that's correct, then the confirmed mine areas were laid during and in the immediate aftermath of a war that ended in 1994. And thus, the alleged breach is dominantly, if not exclusively, based on acts or facts that took place before your temporal jurisdiction begins. Madam President, in case the court finds prima facie jurisdiction over this request, allow me to turn to whether there are any plausible CERD rights that can be linked to it. In Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures, it does not explain exactly why it thinks this request is plausibly linked to rights under the CERD. Instead, it just vaguely says that Armenia's policies and practices target Azerbaijanis for discriminatory treatment falling within the scope of the CERD. The presentations by Professor Lowe and Ms. Amirfar this morning seem to focus on an overall practice of what Azerbaijan calls ethnic cleansing that began well before your temporal jurisdiction, of which the issue of handing over maps is the latest chapter. But the exact policy or practice of Armenia still remains unclear. Is it an Armenian practice of laying mines starting in the 1990s and up until the trilateral statement? Or is it a practice relating to a single alleged incident of mining since the trilateral statement? Or is it a policy by Armenia of being willing to meet to discuss, among other things, which maps Armenia may possess relating to mines that are not pertinent to military defense? Whatever Azerbaijan's view is as to the Armenian policy or practice, arguing a plausible connection to Kurd rights is rather difficult given a simple fact. Landmines, by their nature, do not engage in ethnic discrimination when it comes to the victims that they claim. It matters not to the mine who or what steps on it. In fact, the landmines and explosive remnants remaining from the past 3 decades of armed conflict in this area have harmed Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and others alike, sometimes in the fields they farm, and sometimes in their streets and gardens. Indeed, sometimes the same explosion harms persons of multiple backgrounds. For example, in November of last year, a landmine in Nagorno-Karabakh killed an Azerbaijani officer, wounded several ethnic Armenian officials, and wounded a Russian peacekeeper. Clearly, the mine made no distinction as to the ethnicity or nationality of its victims. All were affected without any such discrimination. Professor Lowe himself this morning said mines are indiscriminate, as has Azerbaijan's Commissioner for Human Rights and Ombudsperson, who has stressed that mines are indiscriminate by nature and that mines have indiscriminate effects. Yet I wish to reiterate that such explosions are not just the product of mines. For example, earlier this year, an ethnic Armenian woman found 32 unexploded shells in her garden in Kakhartsi, which is about 16 miles east of Stepanakert, from one of the cluster bombs that was used in the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh. In that instance, the cluster bombs were clearly dropped by Azerbaijan, which uses Israeli-made cluster munitions that are distinctive for their pink ribbons. No doubt others have found such shells and perhaps mistaken them for mines. In fact, I note that the photographs presented by Azerbaijan in its Annex 36, which contain many duplicates of the same scene, are actually often of unexploded ordnance, not of mines. This is not to say that Azerbaijan citizens in Nagorno-Karabakh have not been harmed by landmines or explosive remnants of war. They have. And that loss of life is deeply, deeply regrettable. Unfortunately, Azerbaijan's media report that since the trilateral statement, many Azerbaijan citizens attempting to visit areas in Nagorno-Karabakh do so in violation of Azerbaijan's law. Apparently, in many cases, these individuals traveled on uncleared roads or cut across open fields to avoid Azerbaijan's military checkpoints. But the point is that Armenia has never used mines to target persons of Azerbaijani ethnic origin, not before the armed conflict in 2020, not during that armed conflict, and not thereafter. There is zero evidence in the record of any such intent, no matter what you hear from counsel on the other side. Any speculation along those lines is just that, sheer speculation with no evidentiary foundation. You cannot point to a photograph of a mine sitting in a field and simply say, aha, it was planted specifically and deliberately for the purpose or effect of racial discrimination. Indeed, it would be very odd for military authorities in control of a territory to lay mines throughout that territory based on a belief that at some unknown point in the future, they would lose control of some of that territory, and on a belief that persons of a specific ethnicity would then come into the territory and would be uniquely harmed by such mines. And it would be equally odd in the heat of a sudden military attack to spend precious time laying mines for anything other than defensive maneuvers. Indeed, I sadly note that a reason why the trilateral statement provided for the return of the bodies of dead soldiers was because retreating forces did not even have the time to evacuate the bodies of fallen comrades. It's simply not credible to think that they ignored their brothers in arms so as to hatch a devious plot of ethnic discrimination. So why would mines have been laid in areas in and around Nagorno-Karabakh? Certainly it was not for the purpose or effect of racial discrimination. It was for the purpose of military defense. And that is clear from Azerbaijan's own pleadings before the court, especially if one looks at that figure 1 from Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures, which counsel for Azerbaijan placed before you this morning. You see now figure 1 on your screen. We are told by Azerbaijan that figure 1 is a map produced by Azerbaijan's Mine Action Agency. Assuming for the sake of argument that there is some accuracy to this map, what does it tell us about the laying of mines in this area? Well, notice first the title of the map. It is referring not just to mines, but also to unexploded ordnance. Thus, while the legend of the map says in various places mines or minefields, this appears to be a map that is concerned with both mines and unexploded ordnance. And typically in the aftermath of a battle, the number of unexploded ordnance will vastly exceed the number of mines. And that's a fact worth bearing in mind when considering the dots on this map. Moreover, that ordnance is due to actions by all sides in the conflict. Let's not pretend that this map is showing exclusively conduct by Armenia. But let's assume this map is, to some extent, showing the location of mines. Where is it that Azerbaijan says that the location of mines is confirmed and is most concentrated? Well, it is that thick red line, which is clearly following the line of contact between opposing militaries that existed for some 3 decades. Any mines located in that area were clearly laid by opposing sides for defensive purposes. Azerbaijan's Mine Action Agency, in Azerbaijan's Annex 32, characterizes the mines in this area as, and I quote, traditional military doctrine barrier defenses, which exist alongside tank ditches, large berms, and barbed wire entanglements. So what these confirmed mines are, they are traditional military defense mines, not some crafty form of ethnic discrimination. Even the website of Azerbaijan's military trophies park refers to this line as part of the, quote, enemy's defensive wall. Well, what about the mines in other areas away from this 3 decades old line of contact? Well, on this map, the areas shaded in orange and yellow are relevant, according to Azerbaijan. Look at the legend of the map. It indicates that for these colors, the existence of minefields is suspected, which means that it is not certain they exist. Moreover, for both the orange and yellow areas, the legend refers to them not just as minefields, but as minefields and battlefields. And battlefields, apparently meaning that they suspect that there are mines in these areas because these areas were battlefields. And please look even more closely and notice that virtually all of these suspected minefields and battlefields in the yellow and orange areas fall along lines, a classic indication that these were further lines of contact as military forces are positioning and repositioning themselves, such as during a 6-week retreat. Indeed, Azerbaijan's own Mine Action Agency in Annex 32 says it characterizes these locations as, and I quote, military positions with patterned mine lines, end of quote. Azerbaijan's Annex 36, also referred to by Council this morning, does not take things much further. At best, it shows a handful of mines have been found by Azerbaijan in areas at a distance from the line of contact. Yet those mines easily may have been laid for defensive purposes, including in agricultural fields, by retreating forces. Indeed, while the Mine Action Agency concludes that they were deliberately laid, that conclusion is consistent with them being laid for defensive and not racial reasons. So in general, we submit that it makes no sense to say that any mines confirmed along this thick red line of contact or mines suspected elsewhere on battlefields were laid as a policy or practice of racial discrimination. They were laid for defensive purposes. There's no other way to look at it. And if a belligerent has to lay mines in farmland while retreating so as to slow down an advancing belligerent, that is no less done for the purpose of lawful self-defense. And it equally makes no sense to say that sharing or not sharing of any existing maps of such minefields is some clever scheme of racial discrimination that somehow violates some provision of the CERD. This is especially the case if, as Azerbaijan says, it is allowing the return of displaced persons regardless of their national or ethnic origin, so that someday Armenian and Azerbaijanis will live side by side. As such, we submit there are no plausible CERD rights being advanced that are linked to this request. I'll immediately seize and desist from planting or promoting or facilitating the planting of landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. I note that this second request seems directed solely at the planting of landmines near the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan and not elsewhere. Azerbaijan's request is based on an incorrect factual claim. As was stated by our agent this afternoon to the court, Armenia is not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan or the Republic of Artsakh. Because Azerbaijan's factual assertion about transboundary laying of mines is incorrect, it's no surprise that Azerbaijan's evidence of any such conduct is severely lacking. Indeed, the only factual basis for Azerbaijan's request is a single incident that purportedly occurred on 27 May of this year. According to Azerbaijan, on that day, it caught Armenian military forces attempting to plant landmines just across the border in Azerbaijan's territory. As we explained last week, Azerbaijan has its facts wrong. In reality, it was Azerbaijan's military forces that crossed into undisputed Armenian territory on that day and unlawfully abducted 6 Armenian soldiers. And unfortunately, Azerbaijan military units continue to be present in such territory even today. But even if one were to assume arguendo the facts as asserted by Azerbaijan, would that single incident of alleged cross-border mining plausibly implicate rights under the CERD? According to Azerbaijan, these were Armenian soldiers who tried to mine the supply routes leading to the positions of the Azerbaijani army on the border, and who were then surrounded, neutralized, and detained by the Azerbaijan military. In other words, these were not Armenian soldiers attempting some devious plot of racial discrimination. They were, on Azerbaijan's own account, trying to secure a military objective, which was to defend Armenia against Azerbaijan military operations on the border with Armenia. Even on Azerbaijan's account, there are no plausible CERD rights at issue. In any event, we submit Azerbaijan's request is clearly moot and presents no issue of urgency. Our agent said clearly to the court this afternoon in his opening statement that Armenia is not planting any landmines in Azerbaijan or Artsakh. And moreover, he assured the court that Armenia respects and abides by its obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. In light of those statements, the request advanced by Azerbaijan no longer has any object, if it ever did. And it follows that the issuance by the court of such a preliminary measure would have no raison d'etre. Madam President, this concludes my presentation. I thank the honorable members of the court for their kind attention. If it please the court, I ask you to now call upon Dr. Salonides.
I thank Professor Murphy, and I now invite Mr. Konstantinos Salonides to take the floor.
Madam President, members of the court, good afternoon. My task today is to explain why Azerbaijan's allegations of incitement of ethnic hatred and violence through an alleged failure to sanction or punish so-called armed hate groups and through an alleged ongoing disinformation campaign are not plausible. There is also no urgent risk of irreparable harm with respect to either part of Azerbaijan's third request. One part of that request asks the court to order Armenia to, quote, cease and desist incitement based on the fabrication of public and private hate speech attributed to Azerbaijanis on Twitter and other social media and traditional media channels. As we heard earlier today from Professor Lo, Azerbaijan argues essentially that, quote, accounts posing as Azerbaijani officials carried messages promoting hatred towards Armenians in order to stir up anti-Azerbaijani sentiment. At the outset, this is with respect a bizarre allegation. As we saw last week, there is no need for Armenian agents to pose as Azerbaijanis for the purposes of spreading hateful words. The Azerbaijani government, from the top down, already spreads such hate on its own. And hatred is already widespread on Azerbaijani social media. I should also say that the allegation is not in good faith, given Azerbaijan's well-documented exploitation of social media platforms, including in relation to, quote, tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Armenia's actions during past escalations in Nagorno-Karabakh. In any case, Azerbaijan has not put before the court evidence that affords a sufficient basis to find it plausible that Armenia is engaging in cyber disinformation operations to incite anti-Azerbaijani hate. Recall that the entire allegation rests on a single statement by a social media company last February. In its request, Azerbaijan represented to the court that on the 23rd of February 2021, Twitter, quote, announced its discovery that the government of Armenia was conducting a coordinated campaign on the social media platform that was deliberately designed to stoke ethnic tensions between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. On the right side of the slide on your screens, what Twitter actually said. Twitter claimed that it had investigated and removed 35 accounts with, quote, ties to the government of Armenia, but had been created, quote, in order to advance narratives that were targeting Azerbaijan and were geostrategically favorable to the Armenian government. I'm not sure how one can make the jump from this statement by Twitter to Azerbaijan's claim of a campaign, quote, deliberately designed to stoke ethnic tensions between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. So we looked at Azerbaijan's other evidence to see if there was anything there to justify this characterization. Annex 34 to Azerbaijan's request includes 3 tweets that Azerbaijan says support its claim. Professor Boisson de Sazourne displayed 2 of those earlier today. I have 3 observations with respect to this evidence. First, Twitter itself acknowledged the possibility that the accounts from which these 3 tweets presumably originated were actually real, and thus not a government subterfuge. Professor Boisson de Sazourne argued that there is no doubt that Armenia has direct ties to these accounts. But as you can see on the screen, Twitter is not so sure. Twitter states that the accounts were hashed to, quote, reduce the potential negative impact on authentic or compromised accounts. Second, as you can see on the next slide, the 3 tweets prompted 0 retweets, quotes, and replies. The Stanford Cyber Policy Institute report Professor Boisson de Sazoun referred to this morning states of the tweets more generally that, quote, the per tweet engagement, which we calculate as sum of, quote, tweets, retweets, replies, and likes, averaged less than 0.1 per tweet. And that, quote, Twitter users called out the accounts as fake. I would respectfully encourage the members of the court to look at that Stanford report more generally, as it does not in any way suggest that Armenia attempted to spread ethnic hatred of any kind. My third point is that it is difficult to see how any of the three tweets actually support Azerbaijan's claim of incitement. Recall the Azerbaijani thesis that Armenian government agents are posing as Azerbaijanis to incite racial hatred. One of the three tweets, however, appears to criticize Azerbaijan. The second one actually calls for peace. And the third one, the Martian tweet Professor Boisson de Sazoun read for us earlier today, is clearly satirical. Hardly an inspiration to engage in ethnic violence, even for the one person who liked it. The rights for which Azerbaijan seeks protection through the second part of its third request are therefore not plausible on the face of Azerbaijan's own evidence. There is also no urgency. All three tweets were posted more than 5 years ago, in April or May of 2016. You can see the timestamps drawn from Azerbaijan's exhibit on the screens. In fact, the Stanford Cyber Policy Institute report explicitly stated that, quote, most of the tweets were sent before 2017. And now on your screens, you can see an image from the report showing the tweet activity. Moreover, even if Azerbaijan's allegations were to be taken at face value, the alleged network of 35 accounts has already been taken down, which Azerbaijan admits in its request. Azerbaijan points to no other evidence to support its allegation of an ongoing disinformation campaign. There is thus plainly no urgency, let alone an imminent risk of irreparable harm. I now move to the second part of Azerbaijan's third request. It asks the court to order Armenia to take, quote, all necessary steps effectively to prevent organizations operating in Armenian territory, including the VOMA organization, from engaging in the incitement of racial hatred and racially motivated violence targeted at Azerbaijanis. Two preliminary observations are in order. First, while this part of Azerbaijan's request implies concern with organizations other than VOMA, it does not mention any such groups. Late last week, in what appears to have been an afterthought, Azerbaijan submitted a new annex containing a Facebook post by another organization called Statehood as a Supreme Value, or POGA, which was also mentioned this morning. My remarks will therefore be limited to these two organizations. My second preliminary observation is that both VOMA, which stands for Art of Survival, and POGA are non-governmental actors. They are not state entities. Armenia has not endorsed and does not endorse or condone the speech of these organizations. Azerbaijan's entire argument of endorsement rests on a single commendation letter allegedly given to 12 volunteers by the armed forces and an alleged joint fire preparation exercise. This cannot possibly constitute endorsement of the group's ideology. I should also mention that Professor Lowe was very liberal with the record in claiming that VOMA members have been invited, quote, have been invited by the Armenian government to join its military efforts. There is absolutely no trace of such a thing, as the evidence Professor Lowe cites for his purposes makes clear. The speech in question is therefore purely private. It is not government speech, let alone presidential speech, which we think sharply distinguishes Azerbaijan's request from Armenia's request last week. The court should not find any plausible violation of shared rights with respect to the speech of these two organizations for the following two reasons. First, Azerbaijan has blatantly mischaracterized the character of both organizations and their activities. Neither one is an armed hate group, as Azerbaijan suggests. Their objectives have nothing to do with incitement to ethnic discrimination. I begin with VOMA. VOMA is a non-governmental organization engaged in emergency and civil military defense preparedness, education, and training. Its objectives are laid out in its charter, and they include increasing overall combat viability, developing physical preparation, and fostering military patriotic spirit. On your screens, you can see the organization's online description of itself as a, quote, non-governmental, militant, nationalist movement that aims to strengthen the defenses of the Republic of Armenia and raise the spirits of the Armenian people. Next to it, there is Azerbaijan's gloss, which Professor Boisson de Sazourne reiterated this morning. Nothing in the organization's online self-description suggests that, quote, VOMA is based on the principle of ethnic superiority, or that it, quote, conveys ethnic hatred against Azerbaijanis. The organization's focus is clearly self-defense and emergency response. The main slogan on its website states, as translated from Russian, "If you want peace, prepare for war." Armenia's 100,000 trained and armed citizens are an opportunity to maintain armed neutrality or to stand up to any potential adversaries and enemies. Other VOMA statements refer to the need to, quote, fortify territory and secure the motherland's safety. And as I will explain in a few moments, Azerbaijan's racist rhetoric and aggressive actions regrettably make the need for self-defense perfectly clear. The second reason why Azerbaijan's alleged rights are not plausible is that the private speech that Azerbaijan has selectively cited does not constitute speech that Armenia must seek to prevent under the CERD. By all objective international standards, and in contrast to Azerbaijan, Armenia is a democracy that values open discussion and debate. Free speech that does not constitute hate speech is protected, consistent with the due regard clause in Article 4 of the Convention. Article 4 requires state parties to take measures designed to eradicate acts of discrimination, quote, with due regard to the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rights expressly set forth in Article 5 of the CERD. Those rights include the right to freedom of opinion and expression, as well as the freedom of association, as laid out expressly in Article 5, subparagraph 8 and 9, respectively. The Third Committee has rightly condemned expressions of racial hatred, but it has also noted, quote, the obligation to respect the right to freedom of opinion and expression when implementing Article 4. Similarly, it has recommended that the state party, quote, guarantee respect for the freedoms of expression and association in its implementation of Article 4A and B. The committee has further made clear that to fall outside the protection of the due regard clause in Article 4, the speech must be of a, quote, exceptionally manifestly offensive character. None of the statements relied on by Azerbaijan approach that standard. Nationalistic and patriotic talk, sometimes offensive and even controversial, certainly. Critical of the state of Azerbaijan, absolutely. But incitement to ethnic hatred and violence against an ethnic group, absolutely not. I would encourage the court to compare those statements to the statements referred to by the committee and found to be in breach of the CERD in the case in footnote, or the statements that the European Court of Human Rights found to be undeserving of protection under the European Convention on Human Rights in the cases cited in footnote as well. According to Professor Boisson de Sazoun this morning, Voma propaganda, quote, Voma propaganda has the effect of dehumanizing Azerbaijanis by raising their humanity and ethnic identity. The issue appears to be statements referring to Azerbaijanis as Turks. Yet, according to the father of Azerbaijan's current president, quote, Turkey and Azerbaijan are one nation in two states, a statement which President Aliyev has recalled repeatedly. The statements are distasteful, but nothing in them incites racial hatred against a particular ethnic group. Professor Boisson de Sazoun also argued this morning that, quote, by not condemning or banning anti-Azerbaijani paramilitary groups, Armenia has allowed these groups to proliferate in its territory. With respect, this is not a serious argument. If we are to look for what led to the creation of POGA, which is the other organization Azerbaijan's request raises, we should look no further than Azerbaijan's racist and threatening rhetoric. I need not address Azerbaijan's racist speech, which was one of the objects of the hearing last week. But I should mention that President Aliyev has repeatedly threatened Armenians with Azerbaijan's, quote, strength, force, iron fist, and power, which according to him, quote, no one can protect Armenians from, not even their, quote, defeated, crushed, annihilated army. 2 weeks ago, he warned Armenians to, quote, behave if they are to, quote, live safely. And Azerbaijan's aggressive actions have matched this rhetoric. The Russian Federation, which has deployed peacekeeping forces in accordance with the November 2020 trilateral statement, has explicitly blamed Azerbaijan for violating the ceasefire. As both our agent and Professor Murphy have noted, Azerbaijan has conducted numerous armed attacks in border regions, and even in Armenia itself, killing Armenian servicemen and prompting Armenia to address the United Nations Security Council and invoke its right to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. Less than 2 weeks ago, an Armenian civilian was murdered by an Azerbaijani sniper near the town of Martakert in Artsakh. Just last Thursday, while we were in hearings before this court, in yet another violation of the ceasefire, Azerbaijan wounded 6 ethnic Armenian soldiers in Artsakh. None of Azerbaijan's evidence establishes that these organizations seek to incite racial hatred, let alone that they have done so, such that the government must act with due diligence to prevent their speech. As such, the rights Azerbaijan seeks to protect through this request are not plausible. And in the absence of any evidence of incitement, Azerbaijan naturally cannot demonstrate urgency. Its own evidence shows Voma's defensive character and desire for peace. Its own evidence shows that neither Voma nor Poga pose an imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to any ethnic group. And indeed, it is difficult to understand how organizations seeking to train Armenians to prepare for another attack waged by an aggressive Azerbaijani state pose any threat whatsoever, justifying the indication of provisional measures in this case. For all these reasons, the first part of Azerbaijan's third request is as deficient as the second. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, this concludes my presentation this afternoon. I thank you for your attention and consideration and kindly request that you now ask Professor Dazan to address the Court.
I thank Mr. Salanides, and I shall now invite Professor Pierre Derjean to address the Court.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, the fourth provisional measure sought by Azerbaijan reads as follows, and it should be on your screen. Armenia shall take effective measures to collect and to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis of which it is aware, including those identified in communications from the Republic of Azerbaijan. By way of comparison, the request that you received from Armenia last week, which is mutatis mutandis identical to that you indicated in 2020 to Myanmar, reads as follows. Azerbaijan shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of the CERD. Aside from the fact, of course, that the addressee of the measure sought by Azerbaijan in this case is different from that you received last week because of the terms that you can see highlighted in yellow on your screen. The respective requests from the parties on evidence are not identical. In fact, as you have seen, looking at the screen, and as I shall demonstrate to you, they are profoundly different. As regards these differences, we can see from them that the measure sought by Azerbaijan must be rejected because it is not consistent with the jurisprudence of the Court as regards preservation of evidence, and it does not serve to protect a plausible right under the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. This will be the first point in my pleading. I shall then show that even limited and reduced to identical terms as those used last week by Armenia, a more limited provisional measure in terms of conservation of evidence would also be without foundation. There are a number of legal and factual reasons that can explain this, and I shall go over that in the second part of my presentation. Madam President, as a provisional measure, and as I have just recalled, Armenia asked you last week to order Azerbaijan to take all effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of any act or fact within the scope of this CERD in order to allow it to claim its rights on the merits subsequently. This request concerned the preservation of all evidence, criminal, of course, but it also covered evidence concerning inter alia Armenian cultural heritage and other violations perpetrated by Azerbaijan. This evidence to be found in Baku and in the territories under Azerbaijan control, and that is why it is for Azerbaijan to preserve the evidence, particularly as I showed last week, Azerbaijan is currently involved in modifying, without any possible return to the status quo, elements from Armenian cultural heritage. This would be the case of Armenian churches that President Aliyev intends to restore, in other words, transform into Albano-Caucasian churches, as was the case with the provisional measure that you granted to Gambia. That sought by Armenia in terms of conservation of evidence is a complement in support of the other provisional measures sought. Azerbaijan is asking you today to do something which in fact is totally different. The measures sought in terms of collection and preservation of evidence is independent of the other measures sought, and it bears no relation to those other measures as it is specific to criminal matters. We could say that it is self-standing. It's not been added, or, to take the terms of Lord Goldsmith last week, it is not an add-on to Azerbaijan's other requests. The provisional measures sought by Azerbaijan in terms of the collection and conservation of evidence is thus different in its object and purpose from that you ordered in order to protect the rights of Gambia and that sought by Armenia last week. Thus, when you order a provisional measure on evidence, we're talking about guaranteeing their conservation and not collection. And it is always in support of other measures ordered to protect the rights at issue so that these can be claimed at the merit stage. To date, the court has never ordered a measure for the collection of evidence. And when you're ordering that evidence be preserved, it's never separate and without any link to other measures indicated. That should be enough in itself to reject the request for the provisional measures sought. However, there is another element that is even more fundamental that also constitutes an obstacle. Indeed, the measure postulated by Azerbaijan, as you have seen, is substantially different from that sought by Armenia. As I have recalled, according to the provisional measure sought, Armenia should seek to collect and ensure the preservation of evidence linked to allegations of ethnically motivated crimes, inter alia, because they have been notified by Azerbaijan. This means that there is a requirement that they would have to provide information concerning, inter alia, the possibility of prosecutions for these grave crimes, and this would refer to notifications by Azerbaijan itself. You will have seen that the request itself is highly ambiguous as to which state should thus be able to prosecute, to take law enforcement action. And Ms. Reid did not clarify the situation this morning. Azerbaijan is not asking you to order Armenia to gather and retain evidence so that Armenia itself can prosecute any possible crimes. No, it is far broader than this. And without excluding this first possibility, in a broader fashion, Azerbaijan is asking also that through the provisional measures sought, it can, if necessary, mete out punishment for the violations it denounces. It should be recalled, in fact, that Azerbaijan's application on the merits uses wording that through the wording itself and through its object as well is broad enough to include the fact that Armenia should make it possible for Azerbaijan to mete out punishment itself for these crimes. On the merits, Azerbaijan is asking that Armenia be ordered to ensure that criminal investigations can be carried out into crimes that it denounces, thus ensuring their punishment. This is what Azerbaijan is asking in its application instituting proceedings on the merits. Armenia must take all steps necessary to comply with its obligations under CERD, including to ensure the investigation and punishment of acts of discrimination, including but not limited to war crimes committed by Armenian forces, etc. The supposed right that Azerbaijan intends to protect through the provisional measures sought is as follows. The right that Azerbaijan allegedly has to require of Armenia that it take all measures making it possible for either Armenia or Azerbaijan itself to investigate the crimes denounced, to prosecute the perpetrators thereof, and to punish them. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, such a right is not plausible under the CERD, and the provisional measure sought by Azerbaijan is not related to any right that state might claim under the Convention. In other terms, the measure sought does not serve to allow Azerbaijan to claim at the merit stage any rights under the Convention. And why? Quite simply because this convention is not an instrument of international criminal cooperation. Admittedly, Article 4A of the convention does oblige states to make certain behavior an offense punishable by law. But the convention does not organize the prosecution or punishment thereof through criminal cooperation among parties. And that is why, as regards the proceedings that were before you last week, Armenia is quite simply asking that you order Azerbaijan to cease its continuous violations of the Convention and consequently punish all acts of racial discrimination. Armenia is asking for nothing more because there's no basis in the Convention to ask for more. In reality, through the provisional measures sought, Azerbaijan is seriously misconstruing the Convention. It's an instrument to protect human rights of individuals through erga omnes partes obligations, but Azerbaijan is trying to turn it into a treaty of legal cooperation containing bilateral obligations among states. But there are other procedures and other instruments that exist for that purpose, including the Minsk Convention of 1993, by which both parties are bound, and which governs the legal cooperation between them, including in criminal matters. So even as a provisional measure, Azerbaijan is not entitled to require of Armenia that it gathers evidence and ensures prosecution on the denunciation of Azerbaijan, nor does Azerbaijan have any right to require of Armenia that it take all measures necessary to allow Azerbaijan to punish itself, to mete out punishment itself for the crimes that, according to it, would have been allegedly been committed by Armenia or its nationals. Such requirements would go well beyond the protection of the rights, plausible rights under the Convention. The provisional measure sought by Azerbaijan has no basis in the Convention. It does not serve to protect a plausible right thereunder, and it has no relationship with the rights that can be claimed by Azerbaijan under the Convention. This measure must therefore be rejected. Madam President, this brings me to the second part of my pleading. Can Azerbaijan claim a provisional measure that is less ambitious in terms of preservation of evidence? Admittedly, it's tempting to treat both parties in the same way and to grant to Azerbaijan in this case what would be granted to Armenia in the previous case. What is more, this is doubtless one of the main objectives behind the mirror proceedings instituted just 1 week after those brought by Armenia. However, even formulated in terms identical to those used last week by Armenia, indication of a more limited provisional measure is in no way justified here for a number of different reasons. First of all, the first reason. In its more limited wording, the measure would become an add-on measure, a measure that's not self-standing as relation to the other measures sought. As demonstrated by my colleagues, those other measures should not be indicated. What is more, an evidence provisional measure, even in its reduced form, must fail as there is no independent basis to sustain it, to paraphrase once again Lord Goldsmith. And then we have the second reason. Even if the impossible were to occur and one of the other provisional measures were to be ordered, the reduced measure concerning preservation of evidence would have no material link with any of the others. It would be, therefore, unwarranted. Third reason. In support of the provisional measure it seeks, Azerbaijan contends that Armenia allegedly did not investigate the violations of international law committed during the 1991-1994 conflict, nor those that allegedly occurred during the more recent conflict in 2020. That was repeated this morning. Azerbaijan concludes in paragraph 29 of its request for an indication of provisional measures, there is a serious risk that alleged perpetrators will flee in order to escape prosecution, that witnesses to these crimes will be unable to be located, and that evidence will deteriorate or become wholly unavailable. Ms. Reid said nothing different this morning. As for the alleged disappearance of evidence concerning the first war between 1991 and 1994, Azerbaijan's case is particularly paltry in this regard, as you will note. What is more, and notwithstanding what was said by the agent for Azerbaijan this morning, it's difficult to see how that state can accuse Armenia of failing to punish acts that allegedly occurred before the entry into force of the convention between the parties in 1996. All the more so as regards the gathering of evidence relating to those facts. The principles of non-retroactivity of treaties and contemporaneity in the law on international responsibility prevent this. Here we have a third obstacle. It is a legal one and it is insurmountable, preventing the indication of provisional measures, even in a reduced version, and concerning the events that are outside the temporal scope of the convention. In any case, distinguished members of the court, how can conservation of decade-old evidence be a matter of urgency while waiting for the court to rule on the merits? As regards the evidence concerning facts that relate to occurrences during the war of 2020, there is a certain amount of footage of abuses that have been filed by Azerbaijan. A significant number of the videos, annexed between numbers 56.1 to 56.11, concern abuses and crimes perpetrated by Azerbaijani soldiers against Armenian soldiers. I have no need to recall to you that certain Armenian victims of such crimes are still being detained in Azerbaijan. And the video footage confirms that they remain in a vulnerable position. At length, Azerbaijan told you how seriously its public prosecutor was investigating crimes committed by members of its military against Armenian soldiers. Here, however, is the way in which the Azerbaijani public prosecutor talks of the videos concerning the crimes committed against Armenian soldiers and filed by Azerbaijan in this case. The sentence that you see on the screen comes from the document that is to be found at tab 10 of the file that you received this morning. It is a letter from the Service of the Public Prosecutor. Although some of the videos were found to be fake, there are serious doubts as to whether some of them are true and reflect reality. Certain videos are fake. Others are deemed to be dubious. That is how seriously the public prosecutor of Azerbaijan is viewing the evidence that he has when it concerns Armenian victims. Such statements from the service that is responsible for criminal prosecutions could, of course, be used in order to obtain acquittal of someone being prosecuted. Other footage filed by Azerbaijan seems to concern abuses and crimes committed by Armenian soldiers against Azerbaijani soldiers. I'm referring to annexes 38 to 52 in the evidence filed last week by Azerbaijan, and Ms. Reid referred to this again this morning. Contrary to what Azerbaijan appears to be suggesting, the question for you, in order to decide whether to grant the provisional measure sought, is not to decide which state is the most diligent in prosecution and punishment of crimes committed in the recent conflict, even if, as Professor Murphy said last week, Azerbaijan's record on the matter is far, very far from being convincing. As you heard this morning, Azerbaijan has made much of its supposed efforts to punish the crimes of its soldiers and always compares them to those of Armenia. This self-proclaimed moral superiority is a precise reflection of the discriminatory and anti-Armenian official rhetoric from Baku. Here, indeed, you have the word used by the public prosecutor for Azerbaijan to describe both the valor of the military of his country and the crimes committed by certain members thereof. And I refer once again to the document at tab 10 of your file of this morning. According to the public prosecutor, respect for international humanitarian law shown by Azerbaijani armed forces is demonstrating the high culture and humanism of our people. On the other hand, when Azerbaijani soldiers commit war crimes, here is the only possible reason. It is regrettable to note that mistakes in the understanding of the methods and techniques of struggle against the enemy by some servicemen under the influence of the severe psychological state caused by the war led to committing illegal acts that could overshadow the bravery and zeal shown by the armed forces, as well as the victory gained. But why is it that these crimes are tarnishing victory? Ms. Reid said this morning that it was because these crimes were unacceptable. Admittedly, but here is the full answer of the prosecutor. If the crimes perpetrated by the Azerbaijani soldiers are unacceptable, it is because those crimes contradict the mentality of the Azerbaijani people, which is tolerant, highly appreciates multicultural values, and is historically distinguished by its humanism. In other words, no such thing is happening in Armenia. As for Armenia, distinguished members of the court, it utterly condemns the abuses committed by any of its armed forces and takes seriously its obligations to investigate and prosecute, and as regards the evidence pertaining thereto. And here I'd like to thank Ms. Reid for having referred you this morning to the communications addressed by Armenia to the European Court of Human Rights, because these clearly show how seriously Armenia takes its obligations. But, distinguished members of the court, as I've already said, you are not comparing the parties' efforts to prosecute these crimes in order to discern Azerbaijan's application. The only question is, the only relevant one, to see whether the factual elements filed by Azerbaijan make it possible to justify a provisional measure narrower than that requested in order to preserve evidence because of imminent risk of the disappearance or destruction of evidence of these crimes. That is not the case. This has not been established, and there are no grounds to believe it to be so. Indeed, you'll find at tab 2 of your file a certified statement from the Deputy Public Prosecutor of Armenia referring to the fact that the services have opened 6 cases for serious criminal violation of international humanitarian law during the hostilities of last year against members of the Armenian armed forces. You heard Ms. Reid say this morning that there was nothing more than that in the Armenian file. She relied on the May 2021 report of the International Partnership of Human Rights and Truth Hounds and the September 2021 report from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which prepared the resolution that was rejected by all of the Azerbaijani deputies. These two institutions, and Ms. Reid as well, have clearly forgotten that in a communication of the 2nd of April 2021, in other words, before the two reports relied on by my colleague. So in that report, which was transmitted to 3 UN special rapporteurs in response to a request for information on the 2nd of February, Armenia described in further detail the 6 criminal cases referred to in the letter of the Deputy Public Prosecutor of that country. You will find the request from the 3 UN rapporteurs and the Armenian response in your file at tabs 3 and 4. These documents are public and they are available on the website of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The special rapporteurs are particularly concerned about the footage of crimes in the videos annexed by Azerbaijan under numbers 38 and 52. As can clearly be seen by the communication sent by Armenia in response on the 2nd of April, the 2 crimes are the object of the first 2 criminal cases that have been opened for a violation of international humanitarian law. The same applies to the videos annexed by Azerbaijan under numbers 39, 41, 49, and 50. The 6 videos in total concern the most patent and shocking violations. Armenia is showing due diligence in prosecuting these crimes and preserving the evidence thereof. As I have already said last week, Azerbaijan also received on the 2nd of February 2021 a similar request for information from the 3 UN special rapporteurs concerning crimes committed by members of the Azerbaijan armed forces against Armenians. Unlike Armenia, Azerbaijan has not bothered to respond to this request for information. As regards the other videos filed by Azerbaijan, you will see that most of them are to do with less serious facts, which is not to say that such facts are acceptable and should not be prosecuted. But that is not the issue here. This evidence is now with Armenia, and its agent has authorized me to inform you that it undertakes to preserve the evidence and to transmit it to its judicial authorities, even if the latter already has them in its possession. Contrary to what was contended by Ms. Reid, it has in no way been established that Armenia would do nothing to investigate the abuses and crimes committed by members of its armed forces. On the contrary, it's been clearly established that Armenia takes its obligations to punish crimes very seriously. Thus, there is no risk of evidence on abuses and crimes committed by or against the members of the armed forces of the other party disappearing. Contrary to the public prosecutor of Azerbaijan, Armenia is taking this evidence most seriously. It's cautiously refraining from making any harmful statement in that regard and does not consider them prima facie to be fake. This is the 4th reason why, even in a limited version, there are no grounds to order Armenia to preserve and prevent destruction of criminal evidence, because Armenia is showing due diligence in this respect. Madam President, in its request for the indication of provisional measures, Azerbaijan seems in reality to be conceding that Armenia is indeed prosecuting the crimes, because it contends that there would be a risk, and I refer to paragraph 29 of the request, the alleged perpetrators will flee in order to escape prosecution. But if the perpetrators of crimes are at risk of flight in order to escape prosecution and punishment, it's because Armenia is organizing this prosecution and is effectively prosecuting for war crimes committed by Armenians. Unless unless, of course, we are to understand that Azerbaijan admits nothing of the sort and is in fact, in so saying, referring to the prosecution it intends to carry out itself. That would then confirm what I said to you a few moments ago as regards the misuse of the CERD by turning it into a legal cooperation treaty. In any case, distinguished members of the court, the provisional measure sought by Azerbaijan on evidence has no basis. No such measure should be indicated against Armenia in these proceedings, as the required conditions are not met. Madam President, this brings to an end the first round of the pleadings by the Republic of Armenia. I'd like to thank the court for its kind attention as ever.
I thank Professor Darjan, whose statement brings to an end the first round of oral observations of Armenia, as well as this afternoon's sitting. The court will meet again tomorrow, Tuesday, 19 October 2021, at 10 a.m. to hear the second round of oral observations of Azerbaijan. Armenia will also present its second round of oral observations tomorrow at 5 p.m. I recall that for the second round, each party will have a maximum of 60 minutes to present its observations. The sitting is adjourned.